Good morning and welcome to Sunday SoulDay, weekly fuel for your mind, body, and soul. Today we have Deanna Hendrick, Senior Director, Events and Brand Experience. She spent 10 years working at places like MTV and 14 years working at their parent company, Paramount. Welcome to Sunday SoulDay, Deanna.
Hi, Demisha. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I am really looking forward to this conversation because we had such a delicious conversation the other day and couldn't wait to get you on the show just to talk about just your incredible background that has been filled with so many just incredible experiences, but also some traumatic ones too. And I really want to share your journey with our audience and also just learn a little bit more about what you're currently up to. So with that said, let's just dive right in. Tell me, where did you grow up? Let's start there.
I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is a very, blue collar, mostly a lot of immigrant, an immigrant town, Steel City. So definitely a more, gritty and just blue collar town.
Absolutely. And when we were talking about your background and kind of your upbringing, what are some of the specific challenges that you faced growing up?
Yeah, I think that, a lot of times when I'm talking about my upbringing, I have to, mention that my parents were immigrants from Italy. And, so their sort of, their foundation was very different from someone who maybe was in the States for many, many decades or generations. They came over, my dad was 12. And so he didn't speak the language. My mother was already here and she, really was a parent for her parents. My grandparents, they worked hard. They stayed in their, Italian communities, but they didn't learn the language. They didn't drive. They didn't do any of those things. And my mother at a very young age had to parent her parents. And my dad, he really was the one that was going to go out there and make something of himself. I think he felt this responsibility to do so. And so when they came to this country and he was 12, he immediately started working wherever he could get a job. He did. And so when I sit down and really hear stories about my parents' upbringings and sort of the generation before them, because I think that's important too, to inform how they grew up. My parents did really well considering what they had available to them, what resources they had available to them, the language that they had available to them. And I don't mean just English. I mean the language to say what they needed or how they felt or how to work through things. That just really wasn't part of the equation. It was very much about, for my parents, doing better than they, than their parents did, which was to make sure that our house had, we had our dinners and we, everything was very predictable in terms of holidays and Sunday dinners and church and family vacations. All of that was very predictable. But I think what became challenging growing up for me and my brother was the emotional component. And we were, by any stretch, by any other terms, American kids, just trying to grow up and be like everyone else, except that we had such different families from everyone at our school. And our parents spoke a different language. They acted different. They were loud. They were yelling. And so a lot of that, what felt like instability or unpredictability in terms of what the day was going to bring, affected us.
Yeah, and I can imagine, and I think it's that generation, what we talked about with our parents. We're from a similar generation. And I think they were just taught to work hard, make sure you have a roof over your kid's head, take care of all of those things. But definitely we're not given the language, the emotional language to even deal with their stuff, let alone yours. And so how did that affect you, growing up? Because you also were raised Catholic, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I specifically with Catholicism, I remember sort of two sides of the coin. One, when I was young, I loved going to church. I loved, it was a ritual. It was something our family did. It was a day of rest. We would go to church. We would talk about where we were going to go for breakfast after. We would go for rides, or we would go on like just some sort of it was a family day, or we would go to my nonna's. We would have, the same spaghetti dinner every Sunday. Like it was very rooted in tradition and started our day, and I loved it. I would sing the songs and then what started happening was I found myself feeling really sad. And it would be a place where I would reflect on the week or the day before, or even the morning. And I would feel really a lot of shame and sadness and I would watch my mother cry every Sunday in church, but not like a joyful, I'm moved kind of cry. Like it was a sad cry. And so I started to, I just knew what church was going to bring for me. It was like when I would sit there and think about, I didn't feel inspired. I didn't feel moved. I didn't feel joyful. I didn't. It was a place for me to feel penance and, sorrow and guilt and shame and all of those things.
That makes it hard to be joyful and really receive the message in that, when you have those emotions coming up every
Of course.
Wow.
And, the sin we lived in, like, you don't sin, you don't do these things. And if you do, you are a bad person, you are going to hell, and that is it. And man, I was rebelling from the day I swear I was born. I just wanted out of my own, this like skin, out of my own, like this cell that I felt like I was contained in. And I was who I was. And I think that in an attempt to sort of, they didn't know what to do with me. In an attempt to control me, they would just yell and, punish and, you do this and you're good. And if you do that, you're bad. And it was very much in line with Catholicism and at least what I had experienced in the church at that time.
Yeah. And you mentioned something that I thought was really extraordinary, just about your parents being so different, but you too felt different too, going to school. What was that like, having immigrant parents and then going to school, looking different,
Yeah.
how did that affect you?
I often think about this piece of my story and wonder how much of this was just normal, like teenage angst, and you feel different. I don't think any preteen or young teen doesn't feel uncomfortable in their skin. They're just trying to figure out how to wear that skin, for me in particular, mine was very rooted in looks. I know it's very much as a woman growing up in a society where, one thing is beautiful, thin is beautiful, blonde is beautiful, all of these things that I sort of internalized as beautiful. And then I would look around, and I grew up in Pittsburgh, which everyone was sort of like segregated. So it was like, I was in a very white school. And so everybody was very thin, blonde, long, flowing hair, and very American parents. And so, people came over to my house and my parents were yelling and screaming and talking different languages. And I mean, it was like, what's happening? This is chaos. And it's like, no, this is just, yes, a little bit of chaos, but also that was just sort of how we all were, all of us Italians. And I remember specifically being very self-conscious about my hair, which, like, I never got a chance to explain to you why I sent Lady Gaga's hair, because I spent the better half of my life trying to figure out how to manage my hair. It was very, very curly, very big, very thick. It was unruly. My mother didn't know what to do with it. She would say to me, like, can't you just brush your hair? And I would be like, no, I can't brush my hair. It will be completely shapeless and big and frizzy. And what do you mean? Or I would try to iron it, or, I mean, my hair was so different from everyone else. And then my skin was dark, and I, always was self-conscious about my nose and thicker thighs and thicker body, and like all of that stuff that I felt self-conscious of, that made me feel like I stood out.
It's so interesting. That is a theme, in the Black community as well, our hair. And to look at you and know that you had a similar experience, is it amazes me, because I'm like, as much as we think we're different, we're, we have a lot of similarities, just on a human level. And, that was a challenge that I had too. My hair, I was probably the only Black kid in my school, growing up for the majority of my adolescence. And, high school is maybe a few,
Yeah.
but definitely felt different always. Until later, I understood that those were strengths, some of those differences, and was able
100%.
do that. But you're right. It's like, I think it's the adolescence in all of us, we're all self-conscious, our bodies are changing, voices are changing, like all of these things. And so, but it's, I'm always curious when, someone, comes from a different country, and what their experience is like, growing up in America. So thank you so much for sharing that. We talked a little bit about your brother, and I'm curious, about his experience kind of growing up in that kind of unpredictable home. Tell me a little bit about, your brother. And I know that he was dealing with kind of mental illness, untreated mental illness. Like, what was that like for you?
I am still on this journey of uncovering and peeling this onion, right? So, and I know we talked about that a little bit, and as I continue to experience things, I can look back and say, particularly with my mother, and say, I understand, I understand why you did the things you did, or why you would have what we perceived as breakdowns. She didn't have the same resources that we do today, and she was alone, and it was very shameful in our parents' generation to ask for help, or to say I'm struggling, or any of that. And I still have pain and trauma from that experience. And I always say that I feel like I was collateral damage I was collateral damage. And I feel like so was my brother. His manifested in different ways than mine. Mine manifested in alcoholism, and a few other things that I'm starting to discover, ADHD, anxiety, bouts of depression, but not, mine is more so rooted in the alcoholism. And my brother's was more, he was younger, and he watched my parents suffer a lot with me. And I say suffer a lot with me because I was sort of on my own trying to figure things out. And as a result, they would try to clamp down on me harder because they didn't know what else to do. And I would rebel more. And the more and more I would hang out with the wrong crowd, and the more and more I would drink, or I would come home drunk, or any of that, they would just ground me. And there was so much chaos, that I would say to this day, they probably all blame on me. I know now it's not, I just wasn't being cared for in the right way. And I also, was who I was, but I think he was just sort of flying under the radar. He did all the right things. He was an amazing musician, still is amazing musician. He was, in the band, and he did all these things. And I think that for our whole upbringing, my parents were grateful for him. They're like, oh, thank God he is not D, we can, thank God we have him. And then I think what happened was, just like any other undealt with trauma, or things that kind of come up or bubble up later, or manifest in the mind, or the stuff, whatever, in his early 20s, he started to just sort of, things started to change. And a lot of different behaviors came to the surface. And, really since then, for the last 25 years, it's been very, 20 years, it's just continued to manifest in different ways that has, from an outsider's point of view, made him non-functioning in society. Not able to keep a job, not able to keep a house, not able to sustain a relationship of any kind, friendships, and such. So, again, going back to that collateral damage, I think that he maintained for a while until it became too much for his body to handle.
Wow. Wow. I can't imagine. And, what's so interesting is with any sort of trauma, right? I always feel like some people, it hits them right away when they're in touch with themselves, right? And when they're not always in touch with themselves, or they're trying to mask, through, activities, sports, being a musician, doing all these things, it shows up later because they try and bury it,
Mm.
And so it's so interesting, how trauma affects us all so differently. And so, I really appreciate you sharing that, because mental illness, in families is just really hard. It's really hard. And, like I have family members that have been diagnosed with bipolar disease, and just those highs and lows and ups and downs is really unpredictable and really challenging to be around. So really appreciate your vulnerability sharing that. I want to switch gears a little bit, because I am so curious. Like, you moved from Pittsburgh to then New York City, completely different worlds. And so, it just seems like such a significant transition when you think about it, going from where you grew up to then this massive city. What was that transition like, and what kind of drew you to New York in the first place?
When I talk about the transition from Pittsburgh to New York City, I always think about this. I swear to you that as a preteen or teen, who knows, whenever Round the Way Girl came out by LL Cool J, I remember sitting in my bedroom and I would just hear him, hear the song, and I'd hear about Queens. And I thought, what's Queens like? What's Brooklyn like? I want to go there. I want to be there with that soul and that, just all of it. I just fantasized all the time about what that could look like and what that could be like. When I met one of my best friends, Laura Luciani from Sicily, I remember I was in college and I was a senior in college, and she came down from New York City with this, it was a .com company at the time that was broadcasting A-list artists concerts. And so Backstreet Boys were at Penn State. And this is significant too, because I remember I happened to run into my counselors at school, and they were like, Dee, hey, we know you love production. And this production company called, and they wanted guys. They were looking for guys in the College of Communications to just lift gear and move boxes and do stuff like that. Do you want their number? And I was like, absolutely. Yes. And so I don't know where that courage came from. It was this desire to yes, I can do it. I can do it. I can do anything in this realm. And so I called, his name was Sebastian, and I called him and I was like, hi, I know you're looking for guys. I'm really strong. I work really hard. Which, side note, a real great ethic to have in parents that work really hard and grandparents that work really hard, right? I am not above any of that. I will sweat. I will get dirty. Let's go. And so I got to the stadium, and I was working, hard. And she walked in the door, and she was the CEO's executive assistant. And she just had this Queens drawl and this New York accent. And she walked in with just, confidence coming out the cells. And she started speaking Italian. And for me, it was very much the first time I saw someone like me at my age and speaking Italian. Now, at this point in my life, because I was so desperate to be different, I'd lost the language. I didn't speak anymore. which I now regret to the marrow of my bones. I'm so regretful of. But she, you know, came in and she was just speaking Italian, and she was this like hot shot girl that was 21. And so long story short, there we became close on that production. And for the rest of my senior year, I started traveling with her all over the world, really, just interning for her, which meant that like all expenses paid, but I wasn't getting paid, which I didn't care because we were doing, you know, Puff Daddy and Family in London and In Sync in Arizona and all these different places. And it was a dream come true. And so when I went to New York for the first time and with her, to meet her and go on one of the trips, the second I came up from the subway and entered that city, I was like, oh my God, this city was made for me. Not only like the energy of it, because it matched my energy inside, it was people of all ages and races and builds and languages. And it was just sexy and just intriguing. And I was addicted the minute I landed, and I was just had to be there. That's where I had to be. It was the best of the best, and I needed to be a part of it. So that transition for me was seamless. And my poor parents who, like, you know, I kind of hit them out of left field that, you know, usually Italian kids, they stay real close to the family. And I was like, I'm leaving. I'm going to New York City. I'm moving to Queens, New York, at 21. See ya. And I can't imagine now how hard that was for them, you know, but for me, it was a dream come true. It really was.
Oh my gosh, you talk about the energy of New York, and I could not agree more. And it's like just this beautiful melting pot of so many different races and languages. And it's so, I love that about New York. Like every time I would visit, I was like, there's just nowhere like anywhere I've ever traveled to that's like New York, like the energy of it. And I love the people, like they're always moving, you know, like they're always, you know, and I when I say that, I mean like true, you know, New Yorkers that have, or even when I say that, like people live there a long time, you know,
Yeah.
they have this energy and fast pace, and they're like, they got somewhere to be. They're like, they're no nonsense, you know.
No nonsense.
I love
That's
it.
the other thing is we get right to it.
No,
It's like,
literally, there's
hi.
no long, like roundabout,
No.
like it's like, you know, but I really appreciate that about that, like so much that I end up naming my niece after my two favorite cities, which is New York and LA. And so her name is Nyla, NYLA. Yeah, so
Love
oh my
that.
goodness. So you moved there at 21, and then how did you start working at MTV? It's just so cool because can I just say you were at MTV when there was nothing compared to it. I mean, like MTV was the mecca. Like if you were in any form of entertainment, it's like you wanted to be on MTV. So just
For sure.
incredible.
That, you know, this is just an example of, you know, one door closing, another one opening. And I like really firmly believe that, you know, I am where I am because of all those doors that had closed. But when I moved to New York, and that company that my friend Laura had worked at, it was during the dot-com bust of 2000. And so that was a dot-com company. I moved all my stuff there and then never worked a day at the company as a paid employee because the company went under. And so I remember saying to myself, like, oh, I'm just going to hang out in New York for a couple more months and then maybe I'll go back to Pittsburgh because that was safe. That was familiar. That is, even though I wanted to be in New York and all of, you know, everything about it was intriguing and satisfying to me, I still felt like I had to do what was safe or comfortable or like, oh, my family and friends are back home. I was always tethered to Pittsburgh. At least I felt that way. And I had a really good friend, Rebecca, that I went to college with, and she happened to be crashing with me in Queens. And she worked at VH1, and she was, you know, just like, I have these like job postings that get printed every Tuesday. I'll bring some home for you. You can apply. I did. I applied and I started working in the ad sales department, which sort of covered all of the different brands. But I saw it as, it wasn't what I wanted to do. I didn't want to do sales, but I was like, I am going to get my foot in the door no matter what. I know I will make some inroads, you know, once I get there, I'll just do this job. And just like anything else that I do, that hard work ethic, like I was a hostess at Denny's, and I'll be damned if I wasn't the best hostess at Denny's. Like I did everything to the best of my ability, and so I killed it in the sales department. They offered me a job that I would have made so much money as a 22-year-old, but I wasn't in New York to do sales. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to be where the action was. And, at the time, the Video Music Awards were always the hottest thing. And so I just like weaseled my way in there in terms of like PAing and all of that. And so PA meaning production assistant. So I would production assistant again for free. I would do a lot of stuff for free because I just wanted to, I wanted to.
I want to touch on that because I love that you said that, that you would do a lot of stuff for free. I remember early in my career, like it was not even a second thought. Like I would work long hours. I wasn't even getting paid for those hours, like, because they were like, oh, well, we can't pay you overtime. I'm like, yeah, but the job wasn't done. And so I'm like, and I wanted to, it's like, that's something I keep trying to instill in my kids, and I worked in, gaming and also tech. And I noticed in gaming, everyone had that same kind of mentality. But then when I got to tech, it was like work-life balance. And I don't, that's not my job. And, like, I'm not getting paid to do that. And I like do not come from that mentality. Like I come from I have no ego, like whatever job needs to get done, like it's going to get done. And also too, like that's how you explore and learn, and make connections. Sure. And so I love that you touched on that. Love.
For sure. I mean, the first VMAs that I ever worked on or volunteered myself on, I remember we were backstage. It was at Lincoln Center, and it was the year that little Kim had like this purple dress on and her little pasty, and it was Puff Daddy came on like a semi trailer. Yes, exactly. But I remember this moment that now, like, looking back, was a moment in time where we were all backstage, and there was like all these press tents out back, and everybody, cameras, techs, press, everyone went completely still when Britney performed Slave for You on the VMA stage. And it was like, everybody was huddled around little like TVs. Everyone was freaking out, and that was just the first of so many different moments that we, became privy to just by, working hard and sort of doing what needed to be done. No questions asked. I don't know that the culture is like that anymore. And I don't know, if anyone's willing to work that hard for any one brand. But at the time, transitioning, I moved from sales to MTV News as an executive assistant. It was more of a lateral move. But again, at the time, I think a lot of people would have said, why are you doing that? You want to move up. And I, again, was like, well, but I want to move here. So I need to just be a little bit more patient. I'm going to move here. And from there, that was really like one of the greatest eras ever of that brand, at MTV News. It was, unfortunately, Michael Jackson passing, and it was, sort of discovery of Kanye, and it was 50 Cent, and it was just every single celebrity that or has been something big was in and out of those rooms and in and out of our offices all day long. It was just where you wanted to be all the time. And I was very grateful for that, Well,
I love that you put yourself in position. And I think a lot of times, like people are craving, climbing the ladder, which is wonderful, and eventually you want to do that. But I also think there's something really important about patience and being, strategic and putting yourself in position. So then you can climb the right ladder, and so I love that you did that. You were there. I mean, gosh, you named just extraordinary people. And I know when we talked, you talked about, like NSYNC and, Puff Daddy and, now Diddy, but back then he was Puff Daddy and,
Yeah. Yeah.
Mace and T.I. and Kanye and Sway even, shout out to Sway. But just is such an iconic brand and just such an iconic moment in just music history. What was that like? Just can you describe like the TRL days and like I mean just
Oh
look
my God.
people walk through the building like I'm like
Oh my God. Well,
like
before 9/11, there was the buildings were open. So we would often there would be like sort of a over the intercom when fans would get in and they would get into elevators and try to find different people. So it was just sort of open in that way, which was hilarious. But the TRL days, I mean, oh my gosh, first of all, Times Square would just basically shut down. And right across the street was Virgin Records. So usually every Tuesday there was a new album release or multiple releases. So it was like Virgin Records would have like the signing. And I remember Michael Jackson, I will never forget. Michael Jackson had a signing at Virgin. I should find this picture somewhere. They're not digital. They were like, regular camera. But Times Square shut down and he got up on a car and was waving and it was insane. And the police every day at 2:00 would start bringing out the barricades, because all the fans would come and who's in the studio today. And it would always be 2 or 3 different big time celebrities. There was this photo booth, that, during that era, every artist that came in would go into the photo booth. So there were these like, picture strips that exist. Britney and NSYNC at the time, that was huge. So every time that they came, it was a big deal. Christina Aguilera,
love.
and so on and so on. But there was always this energy again, like this energy inside that building, inside the most energetic place, inside the most energetic, Times Square, inside of New York City. It like, again, talk about matching what was inside. It was everything.
Oh my goodness. I'm like, you're giving me chills thinking about like Michael Jackson shutting things down. Like, I mean, can you imagine like that being your life everywhere you go? Like I had the privilege of actually meeting him and as a little girl, and I will never forget just that feeling that he gives you in his presence. I don't think I've ever been in anyone else's presence that's done that to me. And I've met a lot of, been privileged enough to meet a lot of celebrities. And I remember meeting him backstage and he was so shy, so that surprised me, just how shy he was. But then, but he was so kind and gentle and, but his presence was just like extraordinary. And then I remember we were sitting like first few rows and he came on stage. And the energy in the building, I've been to so many concerts. I mean, Beyonce at least 6 times, and Beyonce, I will say, she's probably one of the greatest entertainers of our time. But Michael Jackson's presence would literally have people faint. Literally, they'd leave on a stretcher. And I mean, before he even mumbled or muttered a word out of his mouth, it was just mind blowing. So I just can't even imagine having that. Like, and then that's your job.
Oh my gosh.
Every day, like just seeing that like on rotation that is
every day.
Amazing.
I remember we would have meetings, and again, at the time I was an assistant, so I was just sort of watching from the outskirts, everybody talking, all these journalists and producers and talking about what's the news of the day or who are we going to interview this week. And I remember people's names coming up like Black Eyed Peas, like before they were really huge, or Lady Gaga. Like I will never forget, there was like they couldn't get the meeting back on track because people were like laughing and making fun and like hysterical and who's Gaga and who's going to go and who is this Lady Gaga? And I remember us watching one of her first videos and we're like, oh, Christina Aguilera wannabe. And it's just like from that, nobody to meat dress, wearing a meat dress at the VMAs, and like all the logistics around like having this travel meat locker and having this, I mean, like, you know, it's just unbelievable to be able to watch that from behind the scenes. And I don't think any of us knew it. I mean, of course, a lot of us knew that it was special at the time, but we never knew how special it was until now, you know, looking back. And, you know, I met my husband at MTV. And so we have a lot of shared stories and shared experiences, but, you know, between the two of us, I mean, it's just, and all the people that were at MTV News at the time, and it was MTV News and Docs. So there was like Sweet 16, and there was my, True Life and Cribs, MTV Cribs. That was all part of our like team. But just the stories are endless. And we were all a part of this like moment in time that I don't think we'll ever get back to.
I don't think so. And I think, you know, social media has really changed so much of that, because now we have like a peek into celebrities' lives, you know, in a different way. Whereas it's like, that was our peek into their life, you know?
Sure.
So it's just such a different time. But I just thought it was so special. I just remember as a viewer, how much I just looked forward to watching those shows. Like, those were my things. All the shows you named, from Sweet 16 to, you know, all those, I would watch all of those. So, wow, that's just incredible. Now, during this time, you were also, on a personal note, drinking pretty heavily. Tell me a little bit about that. And how did that affect you at work?
Sure. You know, before I have to go back to really when I started drinking, which is, you know, I grew up in a house that my parents didn't drink. There wasn't a lot of drinking happening in my house at all. There was a special closet or cabinet that we pull down if guests would come every once in a while, and it has a couple liquors, you know. And so that was never really modeled for me. And so when I tell my alcoholic story, I always think like there was just something inside of me that gravitated towards that liquid that made me feel a certain way, that just sort of let me feel a little bit lighter. That's the intent with which I drank from the beginning, was just to feel a little bit outside of myself and a little bit lighter. And then it became sort of the fuel for the person that I needed to be to sort of maintain the attention I needed and the accolades I needed. And I was the best partier and all of those things. And so that kind of continued through my 20s and the MTV days. And I think that, you know, to a certain extent, the alcohol part gave me liquid courage to do the things that I was doing. I don't know, you know, I find myself in really vulnerable positions now as a sober woman. And it's hard, you know, it's hard to kind of rally myself and say like, no, you're going to get through this. Let's go. Like, you know, let's go do this uncomfortable thing. Whereas like alcohol kind of helped me, pushed me in uncomfortable situations. And then I was a part of an industry that's what you did. I mean, if that was the very basics, and then there was so much more on top of that. So for me, I used alcohol to connect with people, to feel lighter, to be a little bit outside of myself, sillier, wilder, sexier, all of those things that I could then always blame alcohol for. So if I did a little something that crossed over, or something wasn't just, you know, someone didn't like, I'd say, oh, I just drank too much, you know, but I really did drink too much. You know, it became something physiological where if I would have one drink, I never knew where that drink was going to take me. And it almost never took me after, you know, one drink was never a thing. I mean, to me, if you have one drink, what's the point? That's how I used to think. And so during those years, I mean, I pretty quickly, when I moved to New York, there were a couple of things that happened that were really alarming. One of them was, I remember in the first year that I had moved, I moved there, I was 21, and it was Halloween. It was Halloween, so everyone was out and everyone was dressed up. And I say that specifically because I had several different layers of things on my body. And we went to a club that night, and I must have blacked out like I normally did, and I passed out. And so when I finally came to, it was 10 o'clock in the morning. And I remember there was just one little light over the bar. And this was a massive club in New York City. And a guy sleeping on the, like, sort of like on the bar, and it was the security guard. And, lo and behold, I woke up and I was like, where am I? Like, what's happening? And he said that they, wanted to put me out on the street. At 22, like, they're used to people passing out, drugged up, or drunk, they just put people out on the street, the police take care of them or whatever. I don't know. And that security guard stayed there with me. And like, you want to talk about like God working through people and like showing himself in different ways. Like, that was a God moment. He then gave me money to get home because I didn't have money. I didn't, and that's just one of many examples of things that happened where I woke up and I was like, I should be dead 100 times over. And so things like that kept happening. But because my anxiety and my need for control, was so great, I sort of used that alcohol to my advantage. And I threw a lot of parties, and a lot of industry parties, a lot of city parties. I knew a lot of promoters, a lot of clubs. And I got my accolades and attention fix through that, I didn't know myself without alcohol. I don't think anyone else did either.
Yeah. And during that time, you said that you had like some relationships as well, throughout that period of time that weren't so kind, before you finally got in a relationship with your now husband, who you met at MTV.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, those relationships, if you want, some were real relationships and some of them were situationships. But I felt like my heart was in it just the same. I was so obsessed with love and the idea of being loved that I did anything I could to control it. There were some relationships I had that no matter what this person did, it was never enough. It was never enough for me because, as I've learned in my alcoholism, it's the disease of never enough. There's never enough alcohol. There's never enough love. There's never enough accolades. If I'm looking for something on the outside to fill up my cup, it's never going to be filled. And then there were other relationships where I was in it way more than that person, and so obsessed with getting him to love me. And that the alcohol, the way that alcohol fueled and persisted that sort of, hamster wheel was that I would have really good intentions and do a lot of work in my sober hours. And then the second that alcohol hit my lips, it was as if I turned into a completely different person. And so much so that towards the end of my drinking, I would start to just delete any evidence of me being who that other person was, that alter ego. I didn't want any evidence that that person existed because I was in such denial that I had a problem,
Did it ever show up at work?
Oh, yes. Yes. It showed up in high school. I remember, I had my drinking is ebbed and flowed, and I would hit different bottoms. But I remember, I showed up at school one time. I drank so much the night before, and everyone could smell it on me. And so the counselors, called my parents, and here's where I don't necessarily blame my parents. I'm not as angry as I was, but in moments like that, instead of trying to get to the root cause as to why I was drinking, it was just like, what are you doing? Like, you're grounded. And that was it, And I don't know to be sure that I would have divulged anything that I was feeling. Or if I did, that they were actually truly listening. I think that that's a big thing, is like, they saw me as a little girl and then nothing ever beyond that. I was never a developing teen or a woman or a mother I just was their little girl. So for what it's worth, at work, sometimes I come straight from going out to work. and And to this day, like, you know, there are friends, coworkers of mine that we laugh because we did have really good times where we would have, so Sway, I used to throw this party for Sway, at this place called Tillman's, and it was called like Tillman's Thursday nights or something. And my God, like, whew, it was rough every Thursday night. I mean, it was the like sexiest place in town. We were really, a great crowd, good music. I just recently found actually a little slip of paper that has KRS-One's phone number on it, that he must have given me. I don't know. Anyway, so it was lit. It really was. And I would come to work the next day and I was a shell of a human, and I would sleep. I would go up to different floors, friends' desks, and I'd be like, I have to sleep under your desk. Like, I'm going under your desk, because I was still drunk, or I was exhausted and just unable to pull it together in any capacity. So yes, a lot.
What was the turning point for you? Like, you know, was there something that happened? Sometimes it's like, you know, we had a guest on that talked about his turning point being his lowest point, where he was almost arrested in Vegas, you know, and it was just a really shameful moment because he was found in a closet with another girl while his girlfriend was sleeping in the hotel room. And so, you know, did you have a turning point that was a low point, or was it just like, I really need to go get some help?
I am a happy customer of Alcoholics Anonymous. So usually whenever I tell my story, I always say that I wished my last drink or my last episode was way more dramatic and like blaze of glory than it is. But it was very significant in that I was just on this hamster wheel where I was 32 years old, and I had spent the better half of the previous 5 years obsessed with one person, and that, you know, getting that person to love me or show me that they love me, and how am I going to get him, and how am I going to, and I just like, it was so, I had such a bottom, I had gotten so thin, I wasn't eating, I was just drinking, and then I was depressed, and it was just sort of like, I would try to arrest this obsession with alcohol, and then I would slowly but surely fall back into, you know, blackout or disaster, or, you know. And the last time I drank, I mean, there was nothing remarkable about it except that the next morning when I woke up, I did what I normally do. It's like, is anyone in my bed or in my house? Because I'd have people crash at my house all the time. No. Okay. Is the front door open? Is it closed? Okay, closed. Where's my wallet? My wallet here. Is my phone here? And what's amazing about all of this is that sometimes I would wake up to a pristinely clean apartment, because in my blackouts, I would come home in an effort, because I knew waking up, I would feel like such trash, that I would probably just start cleaning and make sure everything looked good so that I could feel good, which is such a, you know, anyway. And maybe this was it and maybe it wasn't. I don't know. Something about this hit differently. My now husband, Sam, we were really good friends at the time. And I remember starting to sort of like have feelings for him. And someone was like, oh, he's like obsessed with you. And, you know, and I was just like, oh, he's just my buddy. Like, no. And I was getting texts from him that said, are you okay? Like, you said, so, you know, your ex was at your house. I'm worried about you. And I realized that I was just starting this cycle again, this dysfunctional, lying, you know, baiting lie I was just, you know, starting it with a friend who wasn't even a potential suitor. And I just was like, oh my God, like, what am I doing? Like, what is wrong with me? Why can't I stop this cycle? And my closest friend, who I call my sister because she is my sister, Kelly, had, and she says it to this day, she's one of the only people that writes me a very significantly long card every sober anniversary, because she was like, I knew you before you drank. I'm one of the only people that knew you before you drank. And you had this big light inside of you. And then all your drinking years, it was almost out. And she's like, but I always stayed close to you because I knew that that light was inside of you. And it's true. She saw me through really horrific things, really. And she was who I called. It's not different from anything else that I've said to her before in the past, where I've said, I'm done. I just said to her, what do I do? And it was the first time I was willing to listen and say nothing and not give a million excuses as to why I drank or why I got so drunk or I didn't eat enough or I'm so stressed or I'm alone or I'm enough. What do I do? And from there on out, I just took other people's suggestions and then took the next right step.
And you have now been sober for 13 years?
Yes.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Wow.
One day at a time.
Absolutely.
124 hours at a time.
Gosh.
Yeah.
And so your husband, well, now husband, but then was at the time when he texted you, was reporting to you, right? Like you were his boss. And
Yes.
so you guys were, kind of had some feelings for each other, but you weren't, fully exploring that because of that situation as well. What has that journey been like go after, you finally took the first step and went through the 12 steps? When did you guys start dating? Like, did you date during that time or was it after?
Well, a big trend in my life, starting from, I would say, 12 was a really big turning point for me in terms of becoming extremely self-conscious about who I was or what I thought I was and what I looked like. And before that, I had done a lot of things. I danced, I sang, I painted, I was very outgoing. I'm still very outgoing. I was always that, but I didn't care what anybody thought of me. And then at 12, there was this moment where all I wanted was to have boys like me and for every girls to like me. I just wanted to be liked and loved and accepted. And in a way, I know we all do, but that became my guiding light. And so I say that because if you told me that Sam, my now husband, was going to be a potential, that I would have put every single bit of my energy into making that happen. But for the first time in my life ever, not only did I say, I have to put that on hold, I have to put that on hold for myself. And then I have to put that on hold for myself for something that I need help with, that, by society's standards is something that people look down on or can be a real deal breaker for some people. Oh, you're an alcoholic? What does that mean? Like, no, I'm staying far away. And so I knew the risk was to lose him, even as a friend, maybe, but especially as a lover, as a potential, he'll die if I say lover. Yeah, I have to. as a potential relationship, I just was like, it was like relationship suicide, and so I was in the business of being honest in every facet of my life. I'd never been honest a day in my life. I lied about everything because I lied to my parents to get what I needed. I lied to people because I wanted to cover things up, or I couldn't explain away why I did things, or I couldn't, rest in confidence that I made a decision about something without lying about why I came to that decision because someone, lies. And it was the first time I was honest. And I remember we would always go for coffee in the middle of the day in Times Square. And we would, and I remember sitting in Starbucks across the street and I just said, hey, so, I'm going to rehab. And his face, I was 32, he was 27 at the time. And he was in the prime of his partying. And he was like, what? What do you, his face dropped. What do you mean you're going to rehab? Should I go to rehab? He was so confused by it, because he only knew a part of me at the time. But the beautiful thing about it was I was willing to say that really vulnerable thing to this person. And that person then in turn accepted me exactly where I was. And we just were friends. And I needed to focus on that. And we were both friends for the next 6 to 8 months. And it was a really beautiful time because I think we both knew we had feelings for one another, but had no idea how that would happen. I'm 32, I'm 5 years older. I'm his supervisor. I'm getting sober. He's 27, living in the city at the hottest clubs in the world with the hottest group of friends. Like, what? Like, it just, on paper, it looked like a real mismatch.
Yeah, that's so funny. I can't even imagine like, first, even, dating someone at work and then also, or caring about someone at work and then just having that be a thing, just even starting there, and then on top of having, the alcoholism and all the things that you had, he felt like such a safe space for you, which is so beautiful. And I'm like, that's so amazing that you had that in him, like him just checking on you. And so, yes, maybe it didn't make sense on paper, but it made sense to your soul, and it's probably why you were able to show up and be so vulnerable with him in that moment. So I love that for you.
Yeah, I think also I do want to say that during that time, it was the first time I've grown up, as we, mentioned, in the Catholic Church. I really strayed away from the Catholic Church after a few different incidences in my 20s, which we don't need to get into, but I really sort of was I always believed in God. I still always found myself gravitating towards church. But getting sober provided this new way of looking at a higher power and spirituality, and where do I see God and find God, and how do I, where does God work in my life? And it was the first time that I really was listening to something bigger and greater than me. And I would let that, whatever it was, God, the universe, higher power, I would let that go to God or to that person or to that, because I was so in the business of controlling everything. And so there were things I would say to Sam that I was like, well, I've totally ended our relationship after saying that, but it was my truth. And I knew it was my truth. And he would come back, or he wouldn't be scared by it. It was the truth. And my body and my soul started to speak to me in a different way, where it was like, this is right. Some friends of mine would have said, I remember, and we laugh about it today, is I remember a car ride with two of my closest friends, and they said, he didn't say that he loves you yet. And I was like, no. And they were like, get him out. Like, he's out. He's a kid. You don't deserve him. And there was just something about my soul and my body that I was listening to and responding to. And I knew where they were coming from was a good place.
Protective place. Yes, of course.
Totally. But in my mind, and like, it was not my mind, it was my body and my soul and my higher power that was all working together. You remove the alcohol, you can really feel things in a different way. So that really became sort of another guiding force in our relationship.
Wow. I think that's so beautiful. And you're so blessed to have that. Now you were still working at MTV during this time when you decided to take the first step. And how often were you going? Like, how did you do work and do that? I mean, no, seriously, because I'm so curious. Like, I mean, that's the place that you were entering every single day was the same place that you were, drinking, around the same people. Like, how did you do that?
It's so cliche to say one day at a time, but truly what happened was I was just taking the next right step. So I didn't find myself in Alcoholics Anonymous right away. I went into this rehab. And the way that I got through the rehab was Kelly suggested I talk to my therapist. My therapist knew probably way before I did that this was something I was going to need to address. And she went ahead and took some steps to call a few different outpatient rehabs. She knew me well enough to know I couldn't go inpatient because of my job. And it was, again, the first time that I was willing to take other people's suggestions. So in her office, she said, call this rehab. And I said, okay.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Deanna. Be sure to tune in next week for part 2. Have a blessed Sunday.